Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty cool story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. So get cozy, enjoy it, and watch it till the end, guys.
Deep beneath the surface of Terra, where the ancient bones of a world once called Earth still remember the names of forgotten continents and drowned seas, there exists a chamber that few have ever witnessed. The air itself seems to shimmer with barely contained power, and the walls pulse with an energy that transcends the merely physical. At the heart of this sanctum sits a throne of gold, an artifact of such incredible age and complexity that even the most learned tech priests can only guess at its true nature. And upon this throne, what remains of the greatest being humanity has ever known rests in a state that defies simple categorization. He is neither alive nor dead, neither fully present nor truly absent. He is the emperor of mankind, and he has not moved from this seat in 10,000 years. Standing vigil around this throne, arrayed in a perfect circle that has not broken for 100 centuries, are 300 warriors clad in golden armor that catches and reflects light in ways that seem almost unnatural. These are the companions, the innermost ring of the Adeptus Custodes, the emperor's personal guardians. They do not sleep, they do not speak, they do not move save for the subtle shift of weight from one foot to another, a gesture so practiced that it has become as natural as breathing. Their eyes, visible through the crimson lenses of their helms, never waver from their vigil. They watch, they wait, they guard. But what exactly are they guarding? The simple answer that echoes through the vast halls of the Imperium is that they protect the physical form of the Emperor from any who would dare approach with ill intent. This is true, but it represents only the most surface level of understanding. The deeper truth, the secret that lies at the very heart of what the Custodians are and what they do, is far more complex and infinitely more troubling. They are not merely protecting a body, they are protecting a truth, they are maintaining a lie. They are holding together the fundamental structure of reality itself through nothing more than silence and dedication. The golden warriors who stand in these halls know things that would shatter the minds of lesser beings. They have seen what lies beneath the Emperor's golden mask. They have heard the whispers that emanate from the golden throne when the psychic shields waver. They understand, in ways that even the highest-ranking officials of the Imperium cannot fathom, what their master has become in the 10 millennia since Horus struck him down. And they have made a choice, collectively and individually, to never speak of these truths, to guard them as jealously as they guard the Emperor's physical form, to take these secrets to whatever end awaits them, be it glorious death in battle or the slow fade into the mists of time. This is not a story about heroism in the conventional sense. It is not a simple tale of good warriors protecting a benevolent ruler. It is something far stranger and far more terrible. It is a story about the burden of knowledge, about the price of loyalty that extends beyond reason or sanity, about the terrible calculus of lies told in service of a greater truth. It is a story about what happens when those who know the most say the least, and what that silence costs them day by day, year by year, century by century. The Imperial Palace sprawls across what was once the Himalayan mountain range, though the original mountains have long since been incorporated into the vast structure that now dominates the landscape. It is a city unto itself, a fortress the size of a continent, with walls that could withstand orbital bombardment and defenses that layer upon themselves in patterns so complex that no single being could fully comprehend them all. Within this fortress, within a fortress, at its very heart, lies the Sanctum Imperialis, and within that sanctum sits the Golden Throne. Few are ever permitted to approach these inner chambers. Even among the nobility of Terra, among the High Lords who theoretically rule the Imperium in the Emperor's name, there are those who have lived entire lifetimes without ever setting eyes upon the throne room. The Adeptus Custodes control access with an authority that supersedes even the most powerful political positions in the Imperium. They answer to no one save the Emperor himself, and given that he cannot speak in any conventional sense, This effectively means they answer to no one at all. This is no accident. This is design. The custodians understand that what they protect is not merely a physical location or a physical being, but an idea, a myth, a necessary fiction that holds together the fragile sanity of an Imperium that spans 1,000,000 worlds. The citizens of the Imperium, from the lowest hive worker to the mightiest space marine chapter master, believe in the Emperor. They believe he watches over them. They believe he guides their actions through the Emperor's tarot, that he empowers their saints, that his divine will shapes the course of human destiny. And all of these beliefs require that certain truths remain hidden, locked away in the minds of the Golden Guardians, who alone know what truly transpires in the throne room. The weight of this knowledge would crush most beings. To know what the custodians know, to see what they have seen, and yet to maintain perfect silence requires a kind of strength that goes beyond the merely physical. It requires a will forged in the same fires that created the Emperor himself, a dedication so absolute that it transcends individual identity and becomes something greater and more terrible. The origin of the Custodian Guard. To understand why the custodians are uniquely qualified to bear the burden of silence, one must first understand what they are and how they came to be. Their origins stretch back into the mists of history, to a time before the Imperium, before the Great Crusade, before even the Unification Wars that would see terror brought under the rule of a single authority for the first time in millennia. In those dark ages, when humanity's homeworld was divided among countless warlords and techno-barbarian kingdoms, when the very skies burned with the radiation of old wars, and the earth itself was poisoned with the remnants of weapons whose very names had been forgotten, there walked a being of incredible power. This being, who would one day be called the Emperor of Mankind, understood that the task he had set himself, the unification of humanity under a single banner and the eventual conquest of the stars themselves, required more than armies of ordinary soldiers. It required warriors who could stand beside him in the most desperate battles, who could face threats that would drive lesser beings mad, who could be trusted absolutely with secrets that could not be shared with anyone else. And so, using genetic sciences that dated back to the dark age of technology, sciences that he alone fully understood, the Emperor began the process of creating the Custodian Guard. The creation of a custodian is fundamentally different from the creation of a space marine, though both processes involve the transformation of a human baseline into something far greater. Where a space marine is implanted with gene seed, specialized organs that modify their biology in predetermined ways, a custodian is transformed at a much deeper level. The process begins in infancy, sometimes as early as late infancy, when the subject's very genetic code is rewritten at the cellular level. This is not a simple matter of adding new organs or enhancing existing ones. This is a complete restructuring of what the person is at the most fundamental level. Each custodian is unique. Where space marines are mass-produced, following templates established by their primarch's gene seed, each custodian is individually crafted, their genetic enhancements tailored specifically to them. The Emperor himself, in those ancient days, oversaw the creation of each one, applying his vast understanding of genetics and the human potential to create not merely a warrior, but a work of art, a masterpiece of biological engineering. Even after the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne, this tradition continues. The most accomplished bioalchemists and gene wrights of terror, working from the Emperor's original designs, craft each new custodian with the care and attention that others might reserve for the creation of a priceless sculpture. The result is beings who transcend the merely transhuman. Where a space marine is to a normal human as a demigod is to a mortal, a custodian is to a space marine what the space marine is to that baseline human. They are faster, stronger, more resilient. Their minds work with a clarity and precision that allows them to process information at speeds that would overwhelm lesser beings. They do not age in any meaningful sense. A custodian who fought in the Unification Wars might still be alive in the closing years of the 41st millennium. Their skills honed by millennia of experience, their bodies showing no signs of the wear that would have reduced a normal human to dust ages ago. But physical prowess alone does not make a custodian. What truly sets them apart is the nature of their training and their purpose. From the moment they begin their transformation, they are taught not merely to fight, but to think. A Space Marine is trained as part of a unit, learning to work seamlessly with his battle brothers to achieve tactical objectives. A custodian is trained as an individual, expected to be able to analyze any situation, adapt to any threat, and make decisions without requiring orders or support. They study philosophy, history, diplomacy, and strategy alongside their martial training. They learn multiple languages, understand the basics of xenopsychology, and are expected to be able to function as bodyguards, ambassadors, and tactical advisors as the situation demands. This breadth of knowledge serves multiple purposes. On a practical level, it makes them far more versatile than simple warriors. A custodian can guard the emperor in the throne room, lead a diplomatic mission to a distant world, engage in covert operations against threats to terror, or command armies in the emperor's name as circumstances require. But on a deeper level, this education prepares them for the true burden of their role. To guard the emperor's secrets, one must first be capable of understanding what those secrets mean. One must be able to see the implications, to understand the cascading consequences of revelation or concealment, to make the kinds of judgments that lesser beings are simply not equipped to make. The custodians were created to be the emperor's companions as much as his guards. In the early days, before the Great Crusade, they walked beside him through the battles of the Unification Wars. They stood at his side in councils of war, offering their insights and perspectives. They were the only beings, save perhaps for Malcador the Sigillite, who could speak with the emperor as something approaching equals, who could question his decisions and offer alternatives without fear of punishment. This relationship, this sense of being more than mere servants, is fundamental to understanding why the custodians are able to bear the weight of their knowledge. They do not follow orders blindly. They understand why those orders are given. They see the larger picture, the grand strategy that spans millennia and encompasses the entire human race. And because they understand, they can make the choice, freely and with full knowledge of its cost, to maintain the silence that their role requires. This is not blind loyalty. This is loyalty with open eyes, with full awareness of what is being protected and why. It is loyalty that has stared into the abyss and chosen, consciously and deliberately, to guard it rather than to reveal it. The Hussars, number of custodians has remained remarkably stable throughout their history. They are known as the 10,000, and while this number may fluctuate slightly, they work to maintain it at approximately that level. This is not mere tradition. The number represents a careful balance between having enough custodians to fulfill all their duties and keeping their ranks exclusive enough to maintain the individual quality that makes each one such a formidable warrior and guardian. During the Great Crusade, the custodians accompanied the emperor on his conquests, a golden tide that swept aside any who dared stand against the master of mankind. They were present at every major campaign, visible symbols of the emperor's power and authority. But even then, they were selective about what they revealed. They spoke little to outsiders, maintained a certain distance even from the Primarchs and Space Marine legions. They understood, even in those relatively optimistic days, that their first loyalty was not to the Imperium as a whole, but to the Emperor specifically, and that these loyalties might not always align perfectly. The heresy would prove this intuition correct in the most terrible way imaginable. When half the Primarchs turned against their father, when brother fought brother across the length and breadth of the galaxy, the custodians never wavered. Not a single one turned traitor. Not a single one questioned where their loyalty lay. while space marines who had sworn oaths to the Emperor found themselves seduced by promises of power or corrupted by the insidious whispers of chaos, the Custodians remained resolute. This was not chance. This was the result of their creation, their training, and their unique relationship with the Emperor. But the heresy extracted a terrible price from the Custodians nonetheless. As Magnus the Red, in his desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, shattered the psychic wards, protecting the Emperor's secret project beneath the Imperial Palace, demons poured through the breach in the webway. The Emperor was forced to remain on the Golden Throne, using his psychic might to hold the portal shut and prevent Terra itself from being overrun. And the Custodians, along with the Sisters of Silence, were thrown into a war that would rage for years within the dimensional tunnels of the webway itself. This was a war unlike any the Custodians had fought before. The enemy was endless. Demons destroyed in one battle would simply reform and return to the fight. The human defenders, by contrast, could not be easily replaced. Each Custodian who fell was a loss that could never truly be recovered, a masterpiece destroyed that would take years to replace even partially. The 10,000 were ground down, reduced to perhaps a tenth of their number, in a grinding war of attrition that achieved nothing save buying time for the doomed Webway project. When the Emperor finally sealed the portal, when the remnants of the Custodian Guard limped back into the Imperial Palace proper, they were forever changed. They had seen their immortal master, reduced to sitting on a throne for years on end, trapped there by necessity. They had watched as Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted advisor, took the Emperor's place on the throne so that he could face Horus, only to be reduced to ash by the effort. They had borne the Emperor's broken body back from the vengeful spirit, had seen the terrible wounds that Horus had inflicted, had known with a certainty beyond words that their master would never walk among them again. And they had made a choice. As they installed the Emperor on the Golden Throne, as they watched the arcane machinery engage and begin the long process of sustaining what remained of his life, they swore a new oath. They would guard him for as long as necessary. They would protect not just his physical form, but his image, his legacy, his role as the symbol that held the Imperium. Together, they would become the keepers of secrets, the silent guardians of truths too terrible to be spoken. They would don cloaks of black in mourning for the world that might have been, and they would take up a vigil that would last for 10,000 years and counting. The nature of the Emperor's secrets. What exactly do the Custodians know that others do not? What secrets are so terrible that they must be guarded with such absolute dedication? To answer these questions requires venturing into territory that few have ever been permitted to explore, speaking truths that the Imperium itself would rather pretend do not exist. The first, and perhaps most fundamental secret, is the nature of the Emperor's current existence. To the citizens of the Imperium, the Emperor is a living god, barely injured by Horus's treachery, who guides the Imperium from the Golden Throne through his divine will. The Imperial Creed teaches that he hears every prayer, answers every plea, and actively involves himself in the affairs of humanity across the galaxy. This belief has been deliberately fostered by the ecclesiarchy, has been built into the foundational myths of countless worlds, and serves as the spiritual bedrock upon which the entire Imperium rests. The Custodians know this to be, at best, a vast oversimplification, and, at worst, a complete fabrication. They know because they stand in the throne room. They see what the Golden Throne has become, and what it contains. The Emperor's physical body is not merely injured. It is destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. What sits upon the throne is barely recognizable as human. The flesh has withered to nearly nothing, the bones visible beneath skin that has the consistency of ancient parchment. The wounds inflicted by Horus have never healed. They cannot heal. The body is kept alive, if such a word can even be applied, only through the constant intervention of the Golden Throne's arcane machinery and the sacrifice of 1,000 psykers. Every day, their life force drained to sustain what little remains. But the physical state of the Emperor's body, horrific as it is, represents only a small part of the truth. The greater secret lies in the nature of his consciousness, his soul, his essential being. The Emperor's mind has not remained whole and intact within his ruined shell. How could it? To sit immobile for 10,000 years, constantly channeling vast psychic energies to maintain the Astronomicon, to hold shut the breach in the webway, to battle the entities of the warp that constantly seek to overwhelm Terra's defenses, would strain even his vast mental capacities beyond their limits. The Custodians, particularly those few who have been granted the ability to perceive psychic phenomena, understand that the Emperor has become something fundamentally different from what he was. His consciousness has fragmented, parts of it drifting in the warp, while other parts remain tethered to the body on the throne. Some Custodians have reported hearing his voice in their meditations, receiving what might be interpreted as guidance or commands. But these communications are fragmentary, often contradictory, and leave those who experience them questioning whether they are truly hearing the Emperor's will or simply projections of their own desires and fears. There is evidence, circumstantial but compelling, that the Emperor is in the process of becoming a warp entity, a god in truth, rather than merely in the belief of his worshippers. The constant faith of trillions upon trillions of humans, all channeling their devotion toward a single figure, has created a presence in the warp that grows stronger with each passing year. Some among the Custodians believe that this presence is the Emperor, that his consciousness has transcended the limitations of physical form and exists now as a psychic gestalt of humanity's collective belief and hope. Others believe it to be something else entirely, a warp entity that has taken on the Emperor's identity and serves his purposes, whether or not it is truly him. This ambiguity, this fundamental uncertainty about the true nature of what they protect, might drive lesser beings to despair. But the Custodians have made their peace with it. Whether the Emperor is truly still present in some meaningful sense, whether he has become a god, whether he has fragmented into multiple entities, or whether his consciousness has long since dissipated into the warp, the fact remains that the Imperium needs him. Or rather, the Imperium needs the idea of him, the symbol that he represents, the focal point of loyalty and faith that holds together a political entity spanning millions of worlds and countless billions of souls. The second great secret concerns the Emperor's grand design, the project that consumed so much of his attention during the latter years of the Great Crusade, and whose failure ultimately led to his current state. The Imperial Webway project remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in the entire Imperium, known only to the Custodians, the highest-ranking tech priests who worked on it, and a handful of others who have been permitted to access the most restricted archives. The Emperor discovered the Golden Throne long ago, an artifact of the Dark Age of technology, or perhaps even older, buried beneath the wastes of what had once been Asia. This device, through means that even the Emperor did not fully understand, could open a portal into the Webway, the dimensional tunnels that the ancient Eldar had used to traverse the galaxy. The Emperor's vision was grand and, had it succeeded, would have fundamentally changed the course of human history. By gaining access to the Webway and expanding the human-built sections to connect all major worlds of the Imperium, humanity would no longer need to travel through the warp itself. This would eliminate the need for navigators, remove the constant danger of warp storms and demon incursions, and most importantly, would sever humanity's dependence on the warp for interstellar travel. Without this dependence, the Chaos Gods would lose much of their hold on humanity. The mutations, the corruption, the endless whispers that could drive even the strongest souls to damnation. All of these would become far less dangerous if humans were no longer required to plunge into the immaterium itself every time they wished to travel between stars. The Emperor believed that this was the key to humanity's long-term survival, the only way to ensure that the species would not eventually fall to chaos, as the Eldar had fallen to Slanesh. But Magnus the Red, in his desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal, shattered the psychic shields, protecting the nascent human portion of the webway. Demons poured through the breach, and the Emperor was forced to abandon his great work to contain them. The war that followed, fought in the tunnels of the webway by Custodians and Sisters of Homfontal, silence against endless hordes of warp entities, ended in failure. The human sections of the webway were abandoned, the portal sealed, and the Emperor bound to the Golden Throne forever to maintain that seal and prevent demons from using it to invade Terra directly. The Custodians know that this project consumed vast resources, involved tens of thousands of workers and specialists, and represented the Emperor's best hope for securing humanity's future. They know that its failure marked a turning point, the moment when the Emperor's grand vision for the species began to crumble. They know that the current state of the Imperium, trapped in a never-ending war of attrition against countless enemies, represents a pale shadow of what might have been. And they know that this information can never be widely shared, because to do so would be to admit that the Emperor's plans could fail, that he was not infallible, that the current state of the Imperium is not divine will, but the result of catastrophic mistakes. The third great secret concerns what the Custodians have learned about the nature of the warp itself and humanity's relationship to it. Through their long vigil, through their proximity to the Golden Throne, and the psychic maelstrom that constantly churns around it, they have gained insights that would be considered heretical by the standards of the ecclesiarchy. They understand that the Chaos Gods are not merely external enemies, but reflections of humanity's own nature. They know that every act of violence, every moment of despair, every expression of excess or hope for change feeds these entities and strengthens their hold on reality. They understand, as few others do, that the Emperor's vision of a secular Imperium, one based on reason and the imperial truth rather than faith and superstition, was not merely philosophical preference, but practical necessity. The Emperor understood that human faith, human emotion, human belief, these things have power in the warp. They shape reality, they create gods, and he sought to channel these forces in ways that would not empower the ruinous powers. But his vision failed. The imperial creed, the worship of the Emperor as a god, has created a presence in the warp that may indeed be divine, but whose nature and ultimate goals remain uncertain. The Custodians sit at the nexus of this terrible paradox. They serve an Emperor who denied his own divinity, yet they watch as he becomes, or is replaced by, a god. They guard secrets that undermine the very foundations of the Imperium's dominant religion, yet they cannot reveal these secrets without potentially destroying the Imperium itself. They know truths that would be considered the worst sort of heresy, yet they are the most loyal servants the Emperor has ever had. The siege of Terra, and the moment everything changed. The siege of Terra represents the defining moment in the history of the Adeptus Custodes, the point at which everything they had been created to prevent came to pass despite their best efforts. To understand why the Custodians guard their secrets with such absolute dedication, one must understand what they witnessed during those terrible days, when the fate of humanity hung by the thinnest of threads. The siege itself was preceded by years of desperate fighting within the webway. While the heresy raged across the galaxy, while the traitor legions carved a bloody path toward Terra, the Emperor sat immobile on the Golden Throne, using his psychic might to hold shut the breach that Magnus had opened. The Custodians fought in that dimensional twilight, battling demons in corridors that existed between real space and the immaterium. They watched as their numbers dwindled, as brothers who had fought beside them for centuries fell to demonic corruption, or were simply overwhelmed by enemies that could never truly be killed. This war taught the Custodians bitter lessons about the limitations of even the Emperor's power. They saw him, exhausted, saw blood trickling from his nose during the psychic visions he sent to his most trusted servants, saw him slowly grinding himself down in a war of attrition against forces that had infinite reserves. They learned that there were threats that even the master of mankind could not simply destroy, problems that could not be solved through force of will alone. When Horus finally reached Terra and the siege began in earnest, the custodians who remained were a shadow of their former strength. Perhaps 1,000 of the original 10,000 still lived, and many of those bore wounds that would never fully heal. They took their positions defending the Imperial Palace alongside the Space Marine legions that had remained loyal, the Sisters of Silence, and the countless regiments of the Imperial Army. But they knew, with a certainty that went beyond mere military assessment, that the odds were not in their favor. The siege proceeded in phases, each more desperate than the last. The traitors broke through the outer defenses, pushed into the palace complex itself, fought their way through corridor after corridor toward the Sanctum Imperialis. The custodians held where they could, yielded ground when they must, and all the while watched as the Emperor remained bound to the Golden Throne, unable to intervene directly in the battle that would determine the fate of his Imperium. Then came the moment that would be seared into the memory of every custodian who witnessed it. Horus lowered the shields on his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, which hung in orbit above the palace. It was a trap, obviously so, an invitation for the Emperor to come to him. But it was also an opportunity, perhaps the only one that would present itself. The siege was going poorly. Reinforcements from the loyal legions were approaching, but they might not arrive in time. Horus knew this, and he knew the Emperor would know it. He was counting on the Emperor's desperation, his willingness to gamble, everything on a single throw of the dice. The Emperor chose to take that gamble. He gathered a strike force, a small contingent that would teleport directly onto the Vengeful Spirit and confront Horus at the heart of his power. The force included contingents from several loyal legions, but its core was formed by the Adeptus Custodes under the direct command of Captain General Constantine Valdor. The Primarchs Rogel Dawn and Sanguinius accompanied the Emperor, along with a select group of custodian guards, the Emperor's most trusted bodyguards. What transpired on the Vengeful Spirit has been recounted in countless histories, but the versions known to the wider Imperium are sanitized, simplified, stripped of the terrible details that only the survivors truly understood. The truth, known to the custodians, is far more horrifying. When they teleported aboard, Horus used his dark powers to scatter them throughout the ship, separating the force and forcing them to fight their way through. Hordes of traitors and demons just to reach each other, let alone to reach Horus himself. The custodians who accompanied the Emperor found themselves fighting through what had become a literal hell. The Vengeful Spirit had been so corrupted by the warp that reality itself was breaking down aboard it. Corridors twisted and reformed. Demons manifested from thin air. Time itself seemed to flow strangely, with some battles lasting subjective hours, while only moments passed in the material universe. Horus was demonstrating the full extent of his power, showing the Emperor what he had become through his pacts with the Chaos Gods. Many custodians fell in that fighting, but some, through skill and luck and sheer bloody-minded determination, managed to fight their way toward where the Emperor confronted Horus. What they witnessed there would haunt them for the rest of their immortal lives. They saw Sanguinius, perhaps the greatest of all the Primarchs, broken and cast aside by Horus like a discarded toy. They saw the Emperor and his traitor son locked in battle, not merely physical, but psychic, a clash of wills and powers that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of reality around them. And they saw the Emperor hesitate, even at the end, even faced with the full corruption of his beloved son, even knowing what Horus had become, the Emperor could not immediately bring himself to use his full power. He still hoped, in some deep part of his being, that something of Horus remained, that the son he had loved could still be redeemed. This hesitation cost him everything. Horus, empowered by all four Chaos Gods, was beyond any hope of redemption. He was a vessel of their combined malice, a being of such immense power that even the Emperor found himself pressed to his limits. And in that moment of the Emperor's hesitation, Horus struck. The accounts vary in their details. but the essence remains the same. Horus inflicted wounds that would have killed any other being. Instantly, he crushed the Emperor's windpipe, broke bones, tore flesh, and in doing so, demonstrated that even the master of mankind was not truly invincible.
You know, I want to pause here for a second because this really gets to the heart of what makes Space Marines interesting as characters. At least to me, we're used to seeing them as these unstoppable juggernauts, right? Chainswords roaring, bolters blazing, tearing through enemies like demigods. But this scenario strips it all away. No armor, no weapons, no brothers fighting alongside them. Just a mind trying to hold itself together in circumstances it was never designed for. And that's when we see what they really are underneath all the gene forging and indoctrination. They're still human, or at least they started as human. They can still break, they can still feel despair. The fact that most of them don't, and that they endure anyway, that's what actually makes them heroic. Not the superhuman abilities, but the very human choice to keep going. Anyways, back to the story.
Only when a lone custodian, his name lost to history or perhaps deliberately concealed, attempted to intervene and was obliterated by Horus without effort, did the Emperor finally understand the depth of his son's corruption. He saw that nothing of the Horus he had known remained, that this being was merely wearing his son's face while being entirely devoted to the ruinous powers. And in that moment of terrible clarity, the Emperor unleashed his full might. What happened next defies easy description. The psychic energies released in that final confrontation were so immense that those custodians who witnessed it found their minds scarred by the experience. The Emperor focused everything he was, every iota of his vast power, into a single devastating attack. He did not merely kill Horus, he obliterated him, erasing his soul so completely that even the Chaos Gods could not retrieve it. But the cost was everything. The Emperor's body was ruined beyond any hope of recovery, his psychic reserves depleted to their lowest ebb. The custodians who survived the boarding action bore their master back to Terra. They carried him through the halls of the vengeful spirit, fighting off the remaining traitors who sought to prevent their escape. They teleported back to the Imperial Palace with their precious burden, and they delivered him to those who waited. Malcador the Sigillite had taken the Emperor's place on the Golden Throne during his absence, and the effort had reduced him to ash. The Emperor, barely conscious, barely alive in any meaningful sense, was placed back upon the throne. What passed in those final moments before the Emperor fell silent forever, only the custodians who were present truly know. He gave orders, made provisions for the governance of the Imperium, and entrusted certain secrets to Constantine, Valdor and the other custodian guard leaders. Then the Golden Throne fully engaged, the life support systems activated, and the Emperor of Mankind ceased to be able to communicate in any conventional sense. The custodians who witnessed these events understood that they had been party to the end of an age. The Emperor who had walked among them, who had spoken with them, who had led them in battle, was gone. What remained was something else, something that defied easy categorization. They had expected, perhaps, that the Emperor would recover given time and proper care, but as days turned to weeks, and weeks to years, and years to decades, it became increasingly clear that no recovery was coming. The Emperor would never again walk among his people. He would never again speak, save through the most cryptic and ambiguous means. He was, for all practical purposes, gone. And yet the Imperium needed him. Without the Emperor, there was no Astronomicon, no way for ships to navigate the warp with any reliability. Without the Emperor's psychic presence holding shut the breach in the webway, Terra itself would be overrun by demons. Without the Emperor as a symbol, as a focus of loyalty, the Imperium would likely fracture into countless warring factions. His physical presence, such as it was, remained essential, even if his active participation in the governance of the Imperium had ended. The custodians made their choice in those dark days. They would guard what remained. They would maintain the fiction that the Emperor still ruled, that he was merely resting, recovering, preparing for the day when he would rise again and lead humanity to its final triumph. They would become the keepers of secrets, the silent guardians of a truth too terrible to be widely known. They donned cloaks of black in mourning for what had been lost, and they took up a vigil that continues to this day. The philosophy of secrecy. To understand why the custodians choose to hide what they know, one must grapple with questions that go to the very heart of governance, loyalty, and the nature of truth itself. The simple answer, that they hide the truth to maintain stability in the Imperium, is accurate but incomplete. The full answer requires examining the complex philosophical and practical considerations that inform their decision. The most fundamental question is this: does the Imperium have a right to know the truth about the Emperor's condition? From one perspective, the answer seems obvious. The Imperium is theoretically governed in the Emperor's name, with all authority flowing from him. Surely then, the citizens of the Imperium have a right to know the true state of the being in whose name they are ruled. To withhold this information seems like a betrayal of the most basic principles of honest governance. But the custodians would argue, and have argued in the rare instances when they have been pressed on this point, that rights must be weighed against consequences. What would happen if the truth were widely known? What would be the result of announcing to the trillions upon trillions of imperial citizens that the Emperor is not merely resting, but is essentially a corpse kept marginally alive through arcane machinery and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers? The answers to these questions are not difficult to predict. Faith would collapse. The imperial creed, which has become the spiritual foundation of countless worlds, teaches that the Emperor is a living God who actively guides his people. To reveal that he cannot communicate, that he may not even be conscious in any meaningful sense, would shatter the faith of billions. Many would fall into despair. Others would rage against the authorities who had deceived them. Still others would be vulnerable to the whispers of chaos, which promises power and meaning in the absence of the God Emperor's guidance. Political stability would evaporate. The Imperium holds together through a complex web of oaths and obligations, all of which ultimately trace back to the Emperor's authority. If that authority is revealed to be, at best, symbolic, what remains to bind together the countless factions and interest groups that make up the imperial hierarchy? The High Lords of Terror derive their legitimacy from the claim that they govern in the Emperor's name. Without that legitimacy, they become simply another group of warlords fighting over the corpse of a dead empire. Military cohesion would suffer. The Space Marines swear their oaths to the Emperor directly. They believe they fight in his name, that they carry out his will. The Imperial Guard draws courage from the belief that the Emperor watches over them, that their sacrifices are seen and valued by the master of mankind himself. Strip away these beliefs, and what remains? Armies that fight because they are ordered to, because they have no other choice, because the alternative is punishment or death. Such armies can still be effective, but they lack the spiritual cohesion that has allowed the Imperium to survive for 10,000 years. The custodians understand these consequences with a clarity that comes from millennia of observation. They have watched the Imperium evolve, have seen how the imperial creed spread from world to world, how it became not merely a religion, but the fundamental organizing principle of human civilization across the galaxy. They understand that the Imperium, as it exists today, is not the Imperium the Emperor intended to create. His vision was secular, rationalist, based on the imperial truth rather than religious faith. But that vision died at Horus's hands, and what arose in its place was something the Emperor would likely have found abhorrent, a theocracy that worships him as a god. Yet this theocracy, for all its flaws, works. It provides meaning to lives that would otherwise be consumed by meaningless toil. It offers hope to populations that face constant threats from Xenos, heretics, and daemons. It creates a shared identity that spans countless worlds and cultures, uniting humanity in ways that mere political loyalty never could. The custodians may not approve of what the Imperium has become, but they recognize its necessity. They understand that the alternative to this deeply flawed system is not a return to the Emperor's original vision, but chaos, fragmentation, and the likely extinction of the human species. This recognition leads to a second key philosophical position that underpins the Custodians' choice to remain silent. They have accepted that they must serve not the Imperium that was intended, but the Imperium that actually exists. This distinction is crucial. Lesser beings might cling to the Emperor's original vision, might insist that the Imperium must be reshaped to match that vision, regardless of cost. The Custodians are pragmatists. They understand that 10,000 years have passed, that the Imperium has evolved in ways that cannot simply be undone, and that their duty is to preserve humanity, not to enforce a particular vision of what humanity should be. This does not mean they approve of everything the Imperium has become. Many Custodians look upon the ecclesiarchy with barely concealed distaste, recognizing in it a corruption of everything the Emperor fought for. They see the inefficiency, the waste, the countless atrocities committed in the Emperor's name, and they understand that he would be horrified by much of what is done in his service. But they also understand that attempting to reform these institutions, to force them back into alignment with the Emperor's original intentions, would likely cause more harm than good. There is also a deeper philosophical consideration at play, one that touches on the nature of truth itself. The Custodians have access to information that others lack, but does that information constitute the truth in any absolute sense? They know the Emperor's physical condition. They know the details of the Webway project's failure. They have evidence that the Emperor's consciousness has fragmented or transformed. But what they do not know, what they cannot know with certainty, is whether the being they guard is still in some meaningful sense the Emperor. Consider the possibility that the Emperor's essence has transcended his physical form, that he has become a truly divine entity existing primarily in the warp. From this perspective, the physical body on the Golden Throne would be merely an anchor, a focal point for his presence in the material universe. The Imperial Creed's teachings about his divinity would then be more accurate than the secular rationalism of the Imperial truth. The faith of billions would not be misplaced, but would be responding to a genuine reality that exists beyond the merely physical. The Custodians cannot prove or disprove this possibility. They lack the psychic sensitivity to perceive warp entities with the clarity that would be required to answer such questions definitively. They are left in a state of uncertainty, knowing certain facts, but unable to construct from those facts a complete and coherent truth about what the Emperor has become. In such a state, is silence not the wisest course? To proclaim confidently what one does not truly know seems like a greater betrayal of truth than to remain silent and allow others to draw their own conclusions based on what they can perceive and experience. There is another consideration that weighs heavily on the Custodians' collective consciousness. They remember the Emperor not as the distant, godlike figure that most of the Imperium worships, but as the being they walked beside for centuries or millennia. They remember his voice, his presence, his particular ways of thinking and speaking. They have memories that no one else can claim, experiences that cannot be replicated or shared. And these memories inform their judgment in ways that no amount of philosophical reasoning could override. The Emperor told them certain things in those final moments before he fell silent. He gave them instructions, made his wishes known. The details of those conversations are perhaps the most closely guarded secrets in the entire Imperium, known only to Constantine Valdor and a handful of other Custodian leaders, many of whom have since passed into the darkness. But the essence of those instructions was clear: protect humanity. Do what is necessary to ensure the species' survival. Do not let adherence to principles destroy what those principles were meant to preserve. The Custodians interpret these instructions broadly. They understand that protecting humanity means protecting not just individual humans, but human civilization, human culture, the complex web of institutions and beliefs that allow trillions of people to live and work together across vast distances. If that civilization requires certain myths to survive, if it depends on beliefs that are not strictly factual, then so be it. The alternative, a humanity that knows the full truth but lacks the cohesion to survive, is far worse. This philosophical stance might seem like a justification for deception, for maintaining the population in a state of willful ignorance. And indeed, there is something deeply troubling about an elite that knows the truth deliberately, hiding it from those they are meant to serve. But the Custodians would argue that they are not deceiving anyone so much as choosing not to volunteer information that would cause more harm than good. They do not lie when asked direct questions by those with sufficient authority to demand answers. They simply do not offer information that has not been requested, and they control access to the Emperor tightly enough that direct questions are rarely possible. In this, they follow a tradition that extends back to the Emperor himself. He kept many secrets. The Webway project was unknown even to most of his primarchs. The true nature of the Chaos Gods was hidden from all but a select few. He understood that some knowledge is dangerous, that some truths are too terrible to be widely shared, and that effective governance sometimes requires that those in power keep their own counsel. The Custodians, in choosing to hide what they know, are following the example of the master they serve. They are being true to his methods, even if they cannot be true to his original vision. What the Custodians know that others don't. The knowledge that the Custodians possess, knowledge that they guard so jealously, extends far beyond simple facts about the Emperor's physical condition. Through their long vigil, through their proximity to the Golden Throne and the psychic maelstrom that constantly churns around it, they have accumulated an understanding of the deeper reality of the Imperium that would be shocking even to the highest-ranking officials. They know the truth about the Golden Throne itself, an understanding that goes far beyond the sanitized, accounts available in even the most restricted archives. The device is not, as most believe, simply a very advanced life support system. It is not even primarily a life support system. Its original purpose was as a portal into the Webway, a means of accessing the dimensional tunnels that the ancient Elder used for travel. The Emperor adapted it to serve as the anchor point for humanity's expansion into the Webway, using his psychic might to create and maintain the protective shields that would allow humans to traverse those alien passages safely. When Magnus shattered those shields, when the breach was created and demons poured through, the Golden Throne became a prison. It is the only thing preventing those demons from using the portal to invade Terra directly. The Emperor sits upon it, not because he requires its life support functions, though those are now necessary given his condition, but because his psychic power is required to hold the portal shut. Remove him from the throne, or allow his power to fail, and the warp gate would reopen. Terra would be inundated with demons. The throne world itself would become another eye of terror, a permanent wound in reality through which the immaterium leaks into the material universe. The Custodians understand the implications of this with a clarity that haunts their every waking moment. The Emperor cannot die, or rather, he cannot be allowed to die, because his death would mean the death of Terra and quite possibly the entire Imperium. This knowledge transforms their vigil from a matter of honoring their master into a desperate struggle to preserve the last barrier between humanity and total annihilation. They are not guarding a living being, but a keystone, the single point of failure, whose collapse would bring down the entire structure. This understanding also informs their response to various proposals that have been put forward over the millennia for healing the Emperor. Various groups, from radical inquisitors to ambitious tech priests, have suggested schemes for removing the Emperor from the Golden Throne, either to heal his body through new technologies or to allow his soul to reincarnate. The Custodians reject all such proposals absolutely, and now their reason is clear. To remove the Emperor from the Golden Throne, even temporarily, would risk opening the warp gate. The consequences would be catastrophic and immediate. They also know details about the daily operation of the Golden Throne that are kept from virtually everyone else. They know about the 1,000 psychers who are sacrificed each day to maintain the Astronomicon, to provide the psychic energy that the Emperor requires to continue his various functions. They know that this number has been slowly increasing over the millennia, that the Emperor requires more and more sustenance as the ages pass. They know that the tech priests who maintain the Golden Throne are gradually losing the knowledge necessary to perform even basic repairs, that the device is slowly failing despite their best efforts. Most troubling of all, the Custodians know that the Golden Throne is terminal, not in the sense that it will fail tomorrow, or even in the next century, but on a longer timeline, its demise is inevitable. The technology is too advanced, too poorly understood. Parts that fail cannot be replaced, but only patched over with increasingly desperate improvisations. The tech priests speak in terms of centuries or perhaps millennia before critical systems begin to collapse. But this is only their best guess based on incomplete understanding. The truth might be far worse. This knowledge places the Custodians in an impossible position. They know that the current situation cannot continue indefinitely, that at some point in the future, perhaps the near future, the Golden Throne will fail. When that happens, if the Emperor is still bound to it, Terra will be destroyed, and quite possibly all of humanity with it. But they also know that all alternatives are either impossible or potentially more dangerous. They are holding together a system that is gradually falling apart, buying time for a solution that may never come. The Custodians also possess knowledge about the Emperor's psychic presence that extends beyond his physical form. Some among their number, those few with enough psychic sensitivity to perceive such things, report that the Emperor is not simply sitting inert on the throne. His consciousness, or something that might be his consciousness, is active in the warp. They sense him fighting battles against demonic entities that constantly seek to overwhelm Terra's defenses. They perceive him guiding certain individuals, offering cryptic advice or warnings through dreams and visions. They detect his influence in the Emperor's tarot, in the actions of living saints, in the phenomena attributed to the Emperor's divine will. But these perceptions raise as many questions as they answer. Is this truly the Emperor, or is it a warp entity that has assumed his identity? Has the Emperor's consciousness fragmented into multiple separate entities, each pursuing different agendas? Is the being that fights in the warp the same entity that occasionally communicates with Custodians in their meditations? Or are these separate manifestations of a consciousness that has become too vast and complex to remain unified? The Custodians cannot answer these questions with certainty. What they can say is that something using the Emperor's name and claiming his authority is active in the Imperium. Whether this is truly the Emperor they once knew, or something that has evolved from him, or an entirely separate entity that has taken his place, remains unclear. This ambiguity is itself a form of knowledge, an understanding that reality is more complex and uncertain than the simple narratives told to imperial citizens. They also know things about the chaos gods and the nature of the warp that would be considered dangerous heresy if widely disseminated. Through the Emperor's teachings, through their own observations during the war in the Webway, and through 10 millennia of standing guard over the single greatest psychic presence in the galaxy, the Custodians have developed an understanding of the warp that rivals that of the most learned demonologists. They understand that the Chaos Gods are not separate from humanity, but are reflections and amplifications of human nature. They know that every human thought and emotion feeds the warp, that chaos grows stronger with each act of violence, each moment of despair, each expression of uncontrolled desire. This knowledge makes them acutely aware of the terrible irony at the heart of the Imperium's situation. The Imperium fights chaos through methods that feed chaos. Every battle strengthens Khorne. Every moment of suffering and despair empowers Nurgle. The Imperium's military doctrine, its social structure, its entire way of life, all of these continually provide sustenance to the very entities it seeks to resist. The Emperor understood this, which is why he sought to minimize humanity's exposure to the warp and to channel human emotion in ways that would not empower the ruinous powers. But his vision failed, and what has emerged is a civilization locked in a symbiotic relationship with the forces it most fears. The Imperium cannot stop fighting, cannot allow itself to soften or change its harsh ways, because doing so would make it vulnerable to external threats. But in continuing to fight, in continuing to be what it is, it strengthens those very threats. The Custodians see this vicious cycle with painful clarity, and they understand that there may be no way to break it. Perhaps most disturbing of all is what the Custodians have learned about the nature of faith itself. They have watched as the Imperial Creed spread and evolved over 10,000 years. They have seen it become the dominant force shaping human civilization across the galaxy. And they have begun to perceive that this faith has power in ways that go beyond mere psychological comfort. The collective belief of trillions of humans has created something in the warp, a presence that draws on the Emperor's name and image. Some of the most psychically sensitive Custodians believe that this presence is growing stronger, that it is beginning to rival the Chaos Gods themselves in power and influence. They wonder if humanity, in its desperate need for a protector, has succeeded in creating one. They question whether the being that manifests as living saints, that empowers the Grey Knights, that seems to guide humanity through the Emperor's tarot, is the Emperor himself or something new, born from humanity's collective faith and need. This possibility is both hopeful and terrifying. Hopeful because it suggests that humanity might have found a way to fight chaos on its own terms, to create a warp entity that serves humanity's interests rather than preying upon humanity's weaknesses. Terrifying because it means that the Emperor has truly been replaced, that the being they guard on the Golden Throne has nothing to do with the entity that acts in his name, that everything they have been told and everything they believe might be based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. The Custodians do not discuss these possibilities outside their own inner circles. They do not share their suspicions or their fears with the High Lords, with the ecclesiarchy, with anyone who might use such knowledge for political ends. They keep their counsel, continue their vigil, and wait to see what the future will bring. In their silence, in their refusal to claim certainty where none exists, they honor the Emperor's teachings about the importance of honest inquiry and intellectual humility. The burden of knowledge, to know what the Custodians know, to carry the weight of secrets that could shatter the Imperium if revealed, extracts a terrible price from even these superhuman warriors. The burden they bear is not merely psychological, though that element certainly exists. It is also deeply practical, affecting their relationship with every other institution and individual in the Imperium. The isolation begins with the simple fact that the Custodians cannot speak freely with anyone. Even among themselves, certain topics are approached with caution, discussed only in the most secure locations, and only among those who absolutely need to know. The full truth about the Emperor's condition is known to perhaps a few hundred Custodians at most, those who serve in the throne room or who hold positions of sufficient seniority to require such knowledge. For the majority of Custodians, the full picture remains obscured by layers of need-to-know restrictions and carefully controlled information. This necessity for secrecy creates a profound sense of isolation. The Custodians cannot form the kinds of bonds that other warriors take for granted. They cannot share their doubts and fears with comrades, cannot seek counsel or comfort in moments of uncertainty, because to do so would risk revealing information that must remain hidden. Each Custodian, in a very real sense, stands alone with his knowledge, unable to fully trust even his brothers with everything he knows and understands. The relationship with the broader Imperium is even more fraught. The Custodians interact regularly with Space Marines, Inquisitors, High Lords, and countless other Imperial officials. In these interactions, they must constantly guard against saying too much, must carefully measure every word to ensure that they reveal nothing that should remain hidden. They become masters of evasion, of answering questions without truly answering them, of deflecting inquiries with just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything substantial. This necessity for constant vigilance, for eternal watchfulness, not just against external threats, but against their own tendency to speak freely, wears on even the most stoic warriors. Some custodians report feelings of profound loneliness, of being cut off from the very humanity they have sworn to protect. They watch as others go about their lives in ignorance, believing lies that the custodians know to be false, placing faith in things that the custodians understand to be uncertain at best. And they cannot correct these misunderstandings without violating their oaths and potentially causing catastrophic harm. The burden also manifests in more subtle ways. The custodians must maintain the fiction that the Emperor is still actively ruling, still making decisions, still guiding the Imperium. This means that they must sometimes act in the Emperor's name, making choices that they believe he would have made, speaking words that they believe he would have spoken. But they cannot know with certainty that they are correctly interpreting his will. They are making their best guesses based on their understanding of his character and intentions, but these remain only guesses. This creates a terrible responsibility. Every decision made in the Emperor's name carries the weight of potentially billions of lives. Every word spoken with his authority shapes the actions of countless servants across the galaxy. The custodians are, in effect, ruling the Imperium in the Emperor's stead, but they cannot admit this even to themselves without confronting the full horror of their situation. So they maintain the polite fiction that they are merely carrying out the Emperor's wishes, that they are instruments rather than decision makers, that their will does not matter because they are simply extensions of his will. This psychological burden is compounded by the knowledge of their own mortality. The custodians are long-lived, functionally immortal under normal circumstances, but they are not truly indestructible. They can be killed in battle, can be overwhelmed by sufficient force, can fall to wounds that would barely slow a lesser warrior, but that accumulate over centuries, until even their enhanced bodies can no longer compensate. Each custodian who dies takes with him knowledge that cannot be replaced, experiences that cannot be duplicated, memories of the Emperor that grow more precious with each passing year. The most ancient custodians, those who fought in the Unification Wars or the Great Crusade, are living links to a past that grows ever more distant and mythologized. They remember the Emperor not as a god, but as a being they walked beside, whose voice they heard, whose mannerisms and habits they knew intimately. As these ancient warriors gradually fall, one by one, that personal connection is lost. The newer custodians, those created in the millennia since the heresy, know the Emperor only through the stories of their predecessors and their own vigil over his silent form. They serve him with absolute dedication, but they serve an idea, a symbol, rather than the living being that the older custodians remember. This gradual loss of living memory adds another layer of tragedy to the custodians' situation. They are not merely guarding secrets about the Emperor's present condition. They are also the last repositories of knowledge about what he truly was, what he believed, how he thought and spoke and acted. As this knowledge fades, the risk grows that the Emperor will be remembered only as the Imperial Creed portrays him, as a distant and terrible god, rather than as the complex, flawed, but ultimately heroic being that he actually was. The burden of knowledge also affects how the custodians approach their military duties. Unlike Space Marines, who fight with the certainty that their cause is righteous and their actions sanctioned by the Emperor himself, custodians fight with the knowledge that much of what they do is based on necessity rather than clear divine guidance. They make tactical decisions, knowing that they might be wrong, that they are operating without the clear direction that others believe they have. This does not make them hesitant or ineffective. If anything, it makes them more careful, more thoughtful in their approach to combat and strategy. But it also introduces an element of doubt that other warriors do not experience. Space Marines fight with certainty. Custodians fight with questions. They wonder if their actions truly serve the Emperor's will, if they are interpreting his teachings correctly, if the sacrifices they demand of others are truly necessary or merely convenient. These questions haunt them, particularly in the quiet moments between battles when there is nothing to do but stand watch and think. The most profound burden, however, is the knowledge that their situation cannot continue indefinitely. The Custodians know that the Golden Throne is failing. They know that the Emperor's condition is not stable, but is gradually deteriorating. They know that at some point, perhaps in the next few centuries, perhaps not for several millennia, a crisis will come that will force them to make impossible choices. Will they try to keep the Emperor alive at any cost, even if doing so risks terror itself? Will they allow him to die, knowing that his death might doom humanity, but hoping that it might also allow him to be reborn? Will they seek some middle path that might satisfy neither concern, but that might buy a little more time? These are questions without good answers, decisions that should not have to be made by anyone. But the Custodians understand that they will likely be the ones who must make them. When the critical moment comes, when the Golden Throne finally begins its terminal failure, it will be Custodians in the throne room, Custodians who have the authority to make decisions, Custodians who will have to choose between impossible alternatives. They prepare for this possibility, even as they hope it will not come in their lifetimes. They study contingency plans that have been passed down through generations, updated and refined, but never tested. They practice scenarios that they pray they will never have to implement. The Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Web of Lies. The relationship between the Custodians and the other major power structures of the Imperium is defined by layers of mutual deception, half-truths, and carefully maintained fictions. Each organization possesses pieces of the puzzle, but none save the Custodians see the full picture. And even the Custodians must deal carefully with these institutions, balancing the need for cooperation against the imperative to protect their secrets. The Adeptus Mechanicus presents a particular challenge. The tech priests are responsible for maintaining the Golden Throne, for ensuring that its ancient systems continue to function despite their incomplete understanding of its mechanisms. This means that they must have some access to the throne room, must be able to perform their rituals of maintenance and repair. But the Custodians control that access absolutely, determining when tech priests may enter, what they may work on, and what information they may access. The senior members of the Mechanicus understand that the Golden Throne is more than a simple life support system. They know it was originally designed as a portal into the webway, and they know that it is failing despite their best efforts. But they do not know, or at least the Custodians believe they do not know, the full extent of the danger that failure would represent. They do not understand that the portal is still there, sealed but not eliminated, and that its reopening would allow demons to pour directly into the heart of the Imperial Palace. This incomplete knowledge serves both the Custodians and the Mechanicus. For the Custodians, it means that the tech priests will continue to work on maintaining the throne without understanding the full stakes involved. They will apply their skills and knowledge to keeping it functional because that is their sacred duty, not because they understand that the alternative is the destruction of terror. For the Mechanicus, the incomplete knowledge allows them to approach their work as a technical challenge rather than an existential crisis. They can focus on solving engineering problems without being paralyzed by the knowledge of what those problems truly represent. But this arrangement also creates tensions. The Mechanicus resents the restrictions placed on their work, resents the feeling that the Custodians do not trust them with the full truth. Various fabricator generals over the millennia have attempted to gain greater access, to learn more about the throne's deeper functions, to understand the full scope of what they are maintaining. The Custodians have consistently denied these requests, offering only minimal explanations and relying on their absolute authority to shut down lines of inquiry that become too dangerous. In at least one case, this led to a dramatic and highly secret collaboration with the Drukhari, the Dark Elder. When a critical flaw in the Golden Throne was discovered, one that could not be repaired with available Imperial technology, radical elements within the Mechanicus and the Inquisition negotiated with Comora for technical assistance. This arrangement, kept secret from the vast majority of the Imperium, provided a temporary solution that bought several more centuries of function. But it also demonstrated the desperation underlying the entire situation and the lengths to which the Custodians and their allies would go to keep the Emperor alive. The relationship with the ecclesiarchy is even more complex. The Imperial Creed, the dominant religion of the Imperium, teaches that the Emperor is a living God who actively guides his people through divine will. Every prayer, every hymn, every moment of worship is based on the assumption that the Emperor hears and responds. The Custodians know that this teaching is, at best, a gross oversimplification and, at worst, completely false. But they also understand that the ecclesiarchy serves a vital function in maintaining the spiritual cohesion of the Imperium. Without the Imperial Creed, what would hold the Imperium together? Political loyalty alone has proven insufficient, as demonstrated by the countless rebellions and civil wars that have racked the Imperium throughout its history. Economic ties help, but they can be broken when more profitable opportunities present themselves. Military force can compel obedience, but it cannot create genuine loyalty. Only faith, only the shared belief in something greater than mere temporal power, can truly unite populations across vast distances and cultural divides. So the Custodians tolerate the ecclesiarchy, even as they privately despair of its successes. They watch as the priests teach doctrines that contradict everything the Emperor actually believed. They witness the persecution of those who dare to question or to seek rational explanations for the mysteries of the universe. They see resources that could be used for practical purposes instead devoted to building ever more grandiose cathedrals and monuments. And they say nothing, because the alternative would be to undermine the faith that holds the Imperium together. But this tolerance has limits. When the ecclesiarchy oversteps, when it begins to threaten the actual stability it is meant to preserve, the Custodians act. The Age of Apostasy demonstrated this dynamic clearly. When the High Lord Goja Vandaya seized control of the ecclesiarchy and used it to establish himself as a tyrant, when his rule threatened to tear the Imperium apart through mismanagement and corruption, it was the Custodians who helped bring about his downfall. They used secret passages within the Imperial Palace to bring the brides of the Emperor, who would become the Sisters of Battle, into Vandaya's presence. And they allowed those women to see the truth about his rule, trusting that their faith, once properly directed, would lead them to do what was necessary. This intervention was carefully calculated. The Custodians did not depose Vandaya themselves, which would have revealed their own political power and set a dangerous precedent. Instead, they arranged for others to do so, maintaining their position as guardians rather than rulers. They manipulated events from the shadows, using their knowledge of the Imperial Palace's hidden ways and their understanding of human nature to bring about the desired outcome, without directly involving themselves in the political struggle. The High Lords of Terror occupy a middle position in the Custodians' calculations. These officials theoretically rule the Imperium in the Emperor's name, making the day-to-day decisions required to keep such a vast political entity functioning. They have more knowledge than ordinary citizens, more understanding of the true challenges facing the Imperium, but they do not have the full truth, and the Custodians work to ensure that they never will. The High Lords know that the Emperor cannot speak in any conventional sense, that communication with him is limited at best. They know that decisions attributed to his will are often interpretations, educated guesses about what he would have wanted based on his known preferences and past decisions. But they do not know the full extent of his incapacitation. They do not know about the failing Golden Throne. They do not know about the sealed webway portal and the demons that would pour through if it were opened. They are kept in carefully maintained ignorance, allowed to know enough to do their jobs, but not enough to panic or to make decisions based on the full reality of the situation. This management of information extends to how the custodians interact with the High Lords on a daily basis. When the High Lords request audiences with the Emperor, as they periodically do for major decisions, the custodians manage these carefully. Sometimes the request is simply denied, with the explanation that the Emperor is occupied with more pressing matters. Other times, the High Lords are brought into a carefully staged audience, allowed to stand in the presence of the Golden Throne while a custodian speaks in the Emperor's name, interpreting his will based on the custodian's understanding of his intentions. These audiences serve multiple purposes. They maintain the fiction that the Emperor is still actively governing, still accessible to his highest officials. They allow the custodians to guide imperial policy in directions they believe the Emperor would approve, and they reinforce the High Lord's dependence on the custodians as intermediaries, ensuring that no direct access to the throne can bypass custodian oversight. The Space Marines present yet another challenge. These warriors are, in many ways, the closest thing to the custodians' peers. They are transhuman warriors created through genetic modification, dedicated to the Emperor's service, trained to face threats that would destroy ordinary humans. Many Space Marine chapters trace their lineage back to the legions that fought in the Great Crusade, and some of their oldest members might even remember the Emperor before his internment. But the Custodians and Space Marines operate on fundamentally different levels. Where Space Marines are taught to have unquestioning faith in the Emperor's divinity, Custodians know the complexity of what he was and what he has become. Where Space Marines believe they fight in service to the Emperor's clear will, Custodians understand that they interpret that will based on incomplete information and uncertain guidance. Where Space Marines find comfort in certainty, Custodians live with doubt. This difference creates a subtle but significant gap in their relationship. Space Marines often find Custodians somewhat disturbing, sensing something in their manner that suggests knowledge or understanding that has not been shared. Custodians, for their part, envy the Space Marines their certainty, even as they recognize that such certainty is built on foundations of carefully maintained ignorance. Modern developments and the Custodian's dilemma. The return of Primarch Rabuta Guilliman in the closing years of the 41st Millennium has fundamentally altered the dynamics that have governed the Custodian's relationship with the broader Imperium for 10,000 years. For the first time since the heresy, there exists a being who has the authority and the knowledge to challenge the Custodian's control over access to the Emperor, who can demand answers to questions that others would not dare to ask. Guilliman's awakening from his stasis field and his subsequent journey to Terra represented a crisis for the Custodians in ways that few outside their order fully understand. They had spent millennia maintaining the carefully constructed fiction of the Emperor's governance, interpreting his will, speaking in his name. Now they faced a being who had known the Emperor as a father, who had served beside him during the Great Crusade, who would not be satisfied with evasions and half-truths. The meeting between Guilliman and the Emperor, which took place in the most heavily restricted section of the throne room, with only the innermost circle of Custodians present, remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium. What passed between father and son, what communication occurred, what understanding was reached, is known to perhaps a dozen individuals at most. Guilliman emerged from that meeting shaken, his expression suggesting that what he had experienced or learned had fundamentally challenged his understanding of the universe. Since that meeting, Guilliman has not spoken publicly about what he saw or heard, but his actions suggest that he shares, at least partially, the Custodian's understanding that the Emperor's current state is far more complex and troubling than the official histories suggest. He has not contradicted the teachings of the Imperial Creed, has not attempted to dismantle the religious framework that has grown up around the Emperor's worship. Instead, he has worked within that framework, accepting it as a necessary component of the Imperium's current structure, even as he clearly finds aspects of it troubling. The Custodian's relationship with Guilliman is one of careful respect and mutual understanding. He is, after all, one of the Emperor's sons, a primarch, a being of such incredible power and ability that even the Custodians acknowledge his superiority in certain domains. But he is also a political figure, the Lord Commander of the Imperium, with responsibilities and agendas that do not necessarily align perfectly with the Custodians' mandate to guard the Emperor and his secrets above all else. This has led to tensions that play out in ways invisible to most observers. Guilliman has pushed for greater Custodian involvement in the wider military campaigns that define the era Indomitus. He has requested that Custodian forces accompany his crusade fleets, providing their unmatched combat prowess and their moral authority as the Emperor's personal guards to bolster Imperial forces facing overwhelming odds. The Custodians have agreed to this, but reluctantly, and only after lengthy discussions within their own councils about the risks such exposure represents. The concern is not merely that Custodians deployed far from Terra might be killed, though that is certainly a consideration. The deeper worry is that increased interaction with other Imperial forces means increased risk of information leakage. The more Custodians there are operating in the field, the more opportunities there are for them to let slip details that should remain hidden. A casual comment, a moment of unguarded honesty, a response to an unexpected question, any of these could potentially reveal truths that would undermine the careful fictions the Custodians have maintained for millennia. Yet the Custodians also recognize that Guilliman's argument has merit. The Imperium faces existential threats on multiple fronts. The Great Rift has divided the galaxy, cutting off entire sectors from Terra's light. Chaos incursions have grown more frequent and more powerful. Xenos threats from the Tyranids, the Necrons, and others press in from all sides. In such circumstances, the combat effectiveness of even a few hundred Custodians can make the difference between victory and defeat in critical campaigns. So a compromise has been reached. Custodian forces do deploy beyond Terra, but in carefully controlled circumstances. They typically operate in small contingents, shield companies of a few dozen warriors, rather than the massive formations that characterized their deployments during the Great Crusade. They are often attached to torchbearer fleets, the expeditions, that carry the Primaris Space Marine technology to existing chapters across the galaxy. Their presence serves both practical and symbolic purposes. They provide formidable combat support, and they lend the Emperor's authority to these missions, reassuring traditionalist chapters that the introduction of Primaris Marines has the Emperor's blessing. But even as they deploy, even as they fight alongside Space Marines and Imperial Guard across countless battlefields, the Custodians maintain their vigilance. They watch what they say. They guard their knowledge carefully. They remember that their primary duty is not to win battles, but to protect secrets, and they structure their operations accordingly. The formation of the Primaris Space Marines itself represents another challenge for the Custodians. These new warriors, created using techniques developed by Belisarius Cawl over 10,000 years, are in some ways superior to their standard Space Marine counterparts. They are larger, stronger, more resilient, equipped with better gear and more advanced weapons. Their creation involved genetic manipulation at a level not seen since the Emperor himself walked among humanity. The Custodians view the Primaris program with mixed feelings. On one hand, they recognize the necessity. The Imperium's Space Marine chapters have been gradually ground down over the millennia, their numbers reduced by endless wars and slow genetic degradation. The introduction of Primaris Marines represents a desperately needed influx of strength, a way to rebuild depleted chapters and create new ones to face the threats of the era Indomitus. On the other hand, the Custodians cannot help but notice the parallels between the Primaris program and their own creation. Cawl's work draws on some of the same genetic principles that the Emperor used to create the Custodian Guard. This raises uncomfortable questions. Did Cawl somehow gain access to Custodian genetic data? Did Guilliman share such information with him? And if so, What safeguards exist to prevent this knowledge from being misused or falling into the wrong hands? More troubling still is the precedent that the Primaris program establishes. If it is possible to improve upon the Emperor's original Space Marine design, what does that suggest about the limits of his foresight and capability? The official position that Guilliman and Call have fulfilled the Emperor's original intentions by completing research he had begun during the Great Crusade maintains the fiction of the Emperor's infallibility. But the Custodians, who know how carefully the Emperor planned his various projects, have their doubts. The Great Rift itself, the massive warp storm that tore across the galaxy following the fall of Cadia, has implications that extend far beyond the purely military. For the Custodians, it represents evidence that the Emperor's worst fears are being realized. The warp is growing stronger. The barrier between the material universe and the Imperium is thinning. The Chaos Gods are pressing their advantage, seeking to overwhelm humanity through sheer psychic pressure as much as through physical invasion. What particularly troubles the Custodians is that the Emperor does not seem able to prevent this, or rather, if he is still conscious and capable of action, his efforts are proving insufficient to contain the growing crisis. The psychic storms that rack the galaxy, the demons that manifest with increasing frequency, the planets that are simply swallowed by the warp, all of these suggest that whatever the Emperor has become, his power has limits. This raises questions that the Custodians discuss only in their most private councils. Is the Emperor growing weaker? Is his consciousness fragmenting further? Or is he simply being overwhelmed by forces that have grown too powerful for even him to contain? And if his power is insufficient, what hope does humanity have of surviving the nightmares that press in from all sides? Some among the Custodians have begun to advocate for more radical approaches. They argue that the time has come to abandon the careful incrementalism that has characterized Custodian policy for millennia. They suggest that the Imperium needs to know the truth, or at least more of it, so that proper preparations can be made for the Emperor's eventual failure. They point to the example of the Eldar, who nearly destroyed themselves through ignorance and excess, and they argue that humanity is heading down a similar path unless drastic changes are made. Others respond that revelation would cause more harm than good, that the Imperium would tear itself apart in civil war and religious schism long before it could adapt to the truths being revealed. They argue for maintaining the current course, for buying as much time as possible, for trusting that the Emperor's plan, whatever it might be, will ultimately succeed, even if his servants cannot understand its full scope. These debates reflect a deeper anxiety within the Custodian Guard. For 10,000 years, they have followed a clear mandate: guard the Emperor, protect his secrets, maintain the stability of the Imperium. But that mandate was formulated in a different age, under different circumstances. Is it still appropriate for the challenges the Imperium faces today? Should the Custodians adapt their mission to match the changed situation? Or would doing so represent a betrayal of their core purpose? The unspoken fear. Beneath all the practical considerations, beneath all the philosophical debates, there exists a fear that the Custodians rarely acknowledge, even to themselves. It is the fear of what would happen if the truth came out, if the carefully maintained fictions were exposed, if the citizens of the Imperium learned what the Custodians have known for 10 millennia. Imagine the scene. A rogue inquisitor, perhaps, or an ambitious cardinal, somehow gains access to the throne room. They see what the Custodians have been guarding. They see the Emperor's ruined body, barely alive, sustained only by arcane machinery. They see the truth of what has been hidden, and they decide to reveal it. The announcement spreads across the astropathic relay network. Within days, every sector of the Imperium knows. The Emperor is not merely resting. He is not recovering. He is not preparing to lead humanity to final triumph. He is dying, has been dying for 10,000 years, kept alive only through the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers and the frantic efforts of tech priests who barely understand the technology they maintain. The immediate reaction would be shock, disbelief. Many would refuse to accept the revelation. would denounce it as the worst kind of heresy. But others would believe, and that belief would begin to erode the foundations of imperial authority. If the emperor is not truly ruling, then who is? If his divine will is merely the interpretation of custodians and high lords, then what legitimacy does the Imperium possess? If the prayers of trillions mean nothing because the emperor cannot hear them, then what purpose does faith serve? The ecclesiarchy would fracture. Some priests would double down on the imperial creed, arguing that the emperor's physical condition is irrelevant to his divine nature. Others would fall into despair or rage, feeling that they had been deceived by those they trusted most. Schisms would form, with different factions interpreting the revelation in different ways, and all claiming that they alone possess the true faith. Space Marine chapters would face similar crises. Their oaths are sworn to the Emperor personally. If he cannot hear those oaths, if he cannot respond to them, then what binds the chapters to the Imperium? Some would remain loyal out of habit or pragmatism, but others might decide that they owe no allegiance to an institution that has lied to them for millennia. The very real possibility of civil war among the Adeptus, Astartes, would loom. The ordinary citizens of the Imperium, those billions upon billions who labor in hive cities and forge worlds and agricultural planets, would lose the one thing that makes their hard lives bearable: the belief that their suffering has meaning, that the Emperor sees their sacrifices and values their contributions. Depression and despair would spread. Suicide rates would climb. Productivity would plummet. Worlds that had been stable for millennia would descend into chaos as the glue that held their societies together dissolved. And all of this assumes that the revelation remains purely informational, that no physical consequences follow. But the Custodians know that revelation would almost certainly have physical consequences as well. The Chaos Gods would seize upon humanity's shattered faith, would exploit the despair and confusion to launch new assaults. Demon incursions would multiply, warp storms would intensify, worlds would fall to corruption at an unknown, accelerated rate, their populations too demoralized to resist the whispers that promised power and meaning in exchange for souls. Worse still, there is the possibility that revelation would become self-fulfilling prophecy. If enough humans stop believing in the Emperor, stop channeling their faith toward him, would the warp presence that has been building around his image dissipate? If that presence is indeed the Emperor, or part of him, would its dissolution mean his final death? And if it is not the Emperor but something else, something that has been protecting humanity in his name, would its loss leave humanity even more vulnerable than it is now? The Custodians have run these scenarios countless times in their strategic assessments. They have modeled the likely outcomes, analyzed the cascading effects, attempted to find some way that revelation could be managed or controlled. And every analysis reaches the same conclusion: there is no safe way to reveal the truth. The risk is simply too great. The potential consequences too catastrophic. This is the fundamental reason why the Custodians maintain their silence with such absolute dedication. It is not merely tradition or habit. It is not blind loyalty to orders given millennia ago. It is a conscious, informed decision made with full awareness of what is at stake. They understand that revelation would likely destroy the Imperium as surely as any external enemy. They understand that the truth, in this case, is a weapon that would be turned against humanity itself. But this understanding brings with it a terrible isolation. The Custodians know that they can never be truly understood by those they protect. They can never explain why they do what they do, never share the full weight of the responsibility they carry. They must watch as they are sometimes criticized for being too secretive, too controlling, too unwilling to trust others with important decisions. And they must accept that criticism in silence, knowing that explaining their position would require revealing the very secrets they are sworn to guard. This isolation extends even to their relationships with those they would count as allies. Guilliman, despite his position and his relationship with the Emperor, does not know everything the Custodians know. The Inquisition, despite its mandate to root out threats to the Imperium, is deliberately kept ignorant of truths that it would certainly consider relevant to its mission. The Space Marine chapters, despite being the Emperor's chosen warriors, are told only what the Custodians believe they need to know. Even within the Custodian Guard itself, information is compartmentalized, with only those who absolutely must know being granted access to the deepest secrets. This necessity for operational security creates a situation where the Custodians must constantly balance multiple competing imperatives. They must maintain the fiction of the Emperor's active governance while making decisions in his name. They must cooperate with other imperial institutions while ensuring those institutions remain ignorant of critical truths. They must project an image of confident authority while privately grappling with uncertainty and doubt. It is a psychological burden that would crush most beings, and even for the Custodians, specifically designed and trained for such responsibilities, it extracts a terrible price. The weight of 10,000 years. As the 41st millennium draws to a close and the 42nd begins, the Custodians find themselves facing a future more uncertain than any they have known since the dark days of the heresy. The Great Rift has fundamentally altered the strategic situation. Guilliman's return has disrupted the careful equilibrium they had maintained. The Golden Throne continues its slow, inexorable failure, and through it all, the Emperor remains silent, his condition unchanged, his will unknown. The Custodians continue their vigil because that is what they were created to do. They stand watch in the throne room, 300 at any given time, relieved by others who take their place in a rotation that has continued unbroken for 10,000 years. They train in the deep halls, honing skills that were already beyond the comprehension of lesser warriors. They plan for contingencies that they hope will never come to pass. They guard secrets that could shatter the Imperium if revealed. But increasingly, they wonder what comes next. They understand that the current situation cannot continue indefinitely. Something must give. Either the Golden Throne will fail, forcing a crisis that will require immediate and dramatic responses, or humanity will evolve to a point where it no longer needs the Emperor in his current form, where the faith of billions has created something in the warp that can function independently of the body on the throne, or some entirely unforeseen development will change the equation in ways that cannot currently be predicted. The Custodians prepare for all these possibilities as best they can. They maintain contingency plans for the evacuation of Terra should the Webway portal reopen. They study the technology of the Golden Throne, trying to understand its mechanisms well enough to predict when critical failures might occur. They observe the changes in Imperial society, looking for signs that humanity might be ready for certain truths to be revealed. They do all of this while continuing to perform their primary function, standing guard over the being who may or may not still be the Emperor of mankind. In their more philosophical moments, some Custodians wonder if their greatest service to the Emperor is not in protecting his physical form, but in protecting his memory, his vision, the idea of what humanity could become. The Emperor sought to create a unified human species, free from the predations of the warp, guided by reason and science rather than superstition and faith. That vision failed. But perhaps, these Custodians think, the failure is not permanent. Perhaps, given enough time, humanity will evolve to a point where the Emperor's original vision becomes achievable once more. Until then, the Custodians will continue to guard their secrets. They will continue to stand vigil over the Golden Throne. They will continue to speak in the Emperor's name, interpreting his will as best they understand it. They will continue to maintain the fictions necessary to hold the Imperium together, and they will carry the burden of their knowledge in silence, never revealing to others the full weight of what they know, never sharing the doubts and fears that sometimes keep even these superhuman warriors awake during their rare moments of rest. The Golden Warriors standing in the throne room right now, as this account is being recorded, are both the same and different from those who first took up this vigil 10,000 years ago. They are the same in their dedication, their skill, their absolute loyalty to the Emperor and to humanity. They are different in that they guard not a living master, but a symbol, not a clear vision, but an uncertain hope, not known truths, but carefully maintained mysteries. They know things that would shatter the faith of billions. They understand realities that would spark civil wars across the Imperium. They possess knowledge that could doom humanity as surely as any alien invasion or demonic incursion. And they choose, every day, to remain silent about all of it. This is their burden. This is their duty. This is why the Custodians hide the truth about the Emperor. Because sometimes, the greatest act of loyalty is not to proclaim the truth, but to guard it. Sometimes, the highest service is not to share what one knows, but to bear that knowledge in silence so that others need not carry its weight. Sometimes the most profound expression of faith is not blind belief, but conscious choice. The decision to protect something greater than oneself, even at the cost of one's own peace of mind. The Custodians understand all of this. They have understood it for 10,000 years, and they will continue to understand it for however long their vigil must continue. They are the keepers of secrets, the guardians of mysteries, the silent watchers who stand between humanity and truths too terrible to be spoken. They are the 10,000 who guard the One, who protect not just a body, but an idea, who maintain through sheer force of will the delicate balance upon which the survival of the human species depends. And they will never tell you what they know, because they love you too much to destroy you with the truth. If you found this exploration of the Adeptus Custodes and their terrible burden fascinating, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. There are countless other stories waiting to be told from the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps make these deep dives possible. Thank you for watching.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.